We forget that we're surrounded day in and day out by human artifacts, that money isn't just something that has value. It also tells the story of how we've come to negotiate with one another, how we stopped bartering and started using coin. All of that ultimately enriches, I think, the experience person to person in a way that's kind of beautiful. It makes life meaningful.
Welcome back to the Lighthouse Conversations, a podcast featuring entrepreneurs and tastemakers from the worlds of arts, culture, tech, and of course, food. I'm your host, Hasham Montasser. If you're joining us for the first time, hit the follow button in your podcast player to get alerted when we have a new episode, which is typically every other week. You can also listen to our extensive catalog of previous episodes on our website at thelighthouse.ee/podcast. It includes amazing guests like Chef Daniel Boulud, Time Out's Global CEO, Sandy Hayek, Akibadori's founder, Samer Hamada, and Boone's Coffee, Orit Mohammed. I'm joined today by Ivan Brehm, chef owner of the Michelin-starred restaurant Nouri and the creative interdisciplinary space Appetite, both hotspots in Singapore. Ivan, who hails from Brazil and is a self-described mutt with a mixed heritage including Syrian, Lebanese, and German, has a colorful career and has been credited for earning former restaurant Bacchanalia in Singapore its first Michelin star. Ivan worked at celebrated restaurants around the world, Per Se in New York, Mugaritz in San Sebastian, and the Fat Duck in Berkshire. I had the opportunity to spend an evening at Nouri a few weeks ago with my wife and 2 kids. I have to admit, when I walked into Nouri, so much of it reminded me of the same ethos we've had when we started the Lighthouse. The notion that a restaurant is not just about the menu, but really about attacking all your sensations. Your sense of smell, your sense of feel, your sense of sound, all of it. And Nouri does an exceptional job at it. Ivan also tells me that hybridity and curiosity fuel his sense of discovery, and that this gives him the opportunity to do what he calls delicate work with delicious things. Chef Ivan, thank you for joining us. I'm going to let in our listeners on how I met you, if you don't mind, because I think that'll be informative for the rest of the conversation. So I was with my family going through Singapore on our way to Tokyo a couple of weeks ago. And a dear friend of mine who lives in Singapore, who shall remain unnamed for now. I'm just joking. My friend Bobby suggested to come check out your restaurant. I came with my family. We had an incredible experience, both as a culinary experience, as an overall experience, meeting you, your team. So many things struck me, both when we walked in and then during our conversation. And that's why I wanted to have this conversation with you. So thank you for making the time.
Happy to be here, Hashim. Thank you for the invite.
I remember you and I, the first thing I think we talked and sort of laughed about was the fact that when I walked in, you had this little lounge area where we sat before we actually entered the dining area, and you came to speak to us there, which I found incredibly thoughtful. And of course, my restaurateur mind, the first thing that came to mind, my wife was saying, oh, this is so thoughtful and so well curated. And I was also thinking that, but I was also thinking, he gave up that space for like a lounge. I mean, that's not monetizable.
Right.
So we actually talked about that. And the more I had looked post-experience into your work, specifically Nouri, your restaurant, and the curation that you're doing remind me a lot of what we had done in very different style and very different place at the Lighthouse here in Dubai. And I wanted to start there, perhaps understand if this very curated space, and hopefully some of our listeners will come and visit, was intentional when you had the idea of starting Nouri.
No, it kind of evolved. The original idea for Nouri had the bar as a main kind of draw, and that was 6 years ago. We had a really dark bar. It was a place for 10 guests to kind of sit and enjoy drinks and perhaps have a more casual experience of what the restaurant was about. But we noticed that not that the bar wasn't working, it's just guests came in without fully understanding what we were doing. Because so much of the restaurant was about the narrative, the storytelling, the research, and making sure that guests kind of understood before they stepped into the space that the food is obviously the center of the entire experience, but that behind the food, behind that curtain, there was so much more. I needed a space to do that, to be able to kind of introduce the experience to guests, and to maybe use that space also to start them on something, to give them a hint of what we were about. When we did the renovation, I'm like, yep, absolutely. Let's change that straight away. The bar goes, and we're surrounded by really good bars as well.
Is that conversation that you have with the guests when they walk in always part of the experience?
Yeah, absolutely. Either by given by me or by my general manager. The point is that we both uh, give the guest a full explanation of what's to come.
I felt it was a very powerful experience in the sense that, as you said, it really set us up for what's to come. We got to introduce you as well. You're Brazilian, but a heritage is very multicolored, if I may say that, including some Lebanese heritage, which is great for us,
Yes,
given.
yeah, we
So
can
there was
speak
some
similar
commonality
lingo.
there as well
Yeah.
from kind of the Arab world. I was immediately struck by a few things. One is how you were telling stories. And the storytelling is clearly very much part, I think, of your personality, from what I could see, and part of your menu and what you're serving your customers. But it was not just telling stories, it was also telling stories that very clearly connect different parts of the world.
Yeah. The point of the restaurant is to communicate to people through food the incredible amounts of links that unite cultures. And in fact, is an attempt at highlighting the folks that culture doesn't stand in isolation, and that every cultural artifact is the result of interactions that go back time immemorial, right? But we forget these, and it's very easy to fall onto these tropes of my food versus your food, my region versus your region. And so what started as just an impulse to try to verify intuitive kind of assumptions I had about where this dish comes from and how it links and connects to other people became a real curious exploration through research of the history of people and their food traditions. Narrative and storytelling for me are also a way to remind guests that a dish is not just the food, right? I think when you drink a glass of wine or eat a piece of cheese, you're having that product, but you're also having the hands of the farmer, the soil, the grass, and all of those stories, even though they impact the product, they get condensed into that one experience of putting a cheese in your mouth and forgetting about everything else. And so narrative gives us the opportunity to kind of expand that hologram again.
May I just add that even though I admire your story, as an Egyptian, we will still claim hummus and possibly falafel as well. So I just want to kind of put that on the record so that we don't have to fight. I mean, I'm all about uniting.
Right.
But I just wanted to put out
right.
there. Okay, so we will take that.
Especially with hummus.
Yeah, the hummus, exactly. This is what I've been told. So I'm planting a small Egyptian flag. It may or may not grow, and I will leave it there. Do you feel that this is a direct result of your heritage and your own upbringing in Brazil?
I think so. I'm sorry to cut you off, but absolutely. And only at a later stage I figured that out, because initially it came naturally, but I didn't understand why.
Yeah.
But I am the product of a generation of immigrants that ended up meeting in Brazil, right? And I think having to negotiate like a Christmas dinner with Christians, Jews, Muslims, pagans, atheists, agnostics, all sat around the table, trying to figure out who was right and who to vote for and what football team to support, really teaches you how to build bridges, I guess, and try to look for the common thread. I think if you're consistently fed that same image of people who are like you and believe in the same things, you end up finding difference very different. I use that analogy of like we're all the same but wearing different shirts, right? I think difference is a circumstantial thing. It's not an essential thing. If we had the opportunity to walk in each other's shoes for a bit, we'd easily understand why we perform the way we do and why we feel so different. And so,
Has this been accentuated in your mind over the last couple of years, given the kind of hyper polarization that we're seeing globally? You know, a lot more conflict, obviously, a lot more polarization left and right, especially in the US, but also in other places. Brazil actually comes to mind. I mean,
yeah.
so do you feel that has heightened that feeling in you?
I think the feeling remains the same, but it heightened my sense of urgency. I think before it was just something I believed in and I thought it was just whatever. But now I look around and I do feel like it's an important job, to communicate to people that at times like this, we need to come together. It's very easy, I think, to preserve blood ties. During COVID, we experienced this, for example, right? This notion that the only people we really had direct access to were our closest families. Otherwise, we would ask to be apart, right? Like social distance, to not connect. But it does take relearning and a relative amount of effort to come near a stranger, to engage and interact. And we have the beauty of doing that in one of the last types of social spaces that exists, which is a restaurant. Like when we boil it down, like the town hall doesn't exist anymore. To meet in person right now, you are either at a restaurant or a bar. And
Yes, correct.
so that gives us the opportunity to maybe do that very delicate work with very delicious things.
But you seem very deliberate and intent on having a conversation and having a dialogue. I mean, in some ways, your restaurant felt a bit like almost like a Kunsthalle in some ways. It felt like, a multidisciplinary space, not just a restaurant. And I know from doing some research that upstairs you have another space, correct? Where you
Yeah.
are actually doing that, where you're, exhibiting art, maybe having some music. So you clearly see a connection here between your food and arts and culture. And it seems like you want to do that. You want to have that conversation.
Obviously, we like all of the things that we are handling, right? I'm a music lover. We love art. But ultimately, I think the understanding that these things are really all just people artifacts, right?
I mean, your music list was epic, by the way. I mean, that
Thank
was
you.
like, it made my
Yeah,
entire, I mean, we sat there for a couple of hours and I'm like, remember still like bopping my head, like in between, dish 2 and 3. And then my whole family joined in, if you recall. So that
I
was
do
fantastic.
recall. And kudos to you. I mean, you were very complimentary of me when you started. Let me be complimentary of you. What a wonderful family you have. It was
Thank you.
tremendous to feed them. Your daughter and son were like so eloquent and
Thank you, Ivan.
gourmands, very young gourmands.
It sets the bar a little
It
high.
does.
We'll see where we go with it, but thank you.
Pressure is on. When I started to notice that a dish is kind of like a door into an entire people, right? Like you can explore
Yeah.
that as a door or a window. It was the realization that the work was being done because ultimately we're just trying to figure out people, right? It's not really about food. I think people are curious about people. It's not really about art. It's just what is it about people that is expressed in artistic work that we can see ourselves in. And I think most of the problems we experience nowadays regarding consumption of art or any other product is because we lost that human factor, that people are looking at things in a way that is too plasticky and very much finite. It's about the technique employed. It's about the thing in your hand. It's about its value monetary. It's about the label. And we forget that we're surrounded day in and day out by human artifacts, that money isn't just something that has value. It also tells the story of how we've come to negotiate with one another, how we stopped bartering and started using coin. And all of that ultimately enriches, I think, the experience person to person in a way that's but kind of beautiful. It makes life meaningful. And so the point of the space downstairs and the spaces upstairs, and indeed the interaction that you picked up, is that ultimately everything about those venues is literally about those interactive moments. the exchange that happens between the wait staff and the guest, between the guest and the stranger, how they have to negotiate the random exchange. Imagine I had the benefit of introducing the restaurant just for yourself and your family, but at times there's multiple tables sitting there,
Yeah.
and we deliberately make them wait. We don't, I don't share that with a lot of people, but we purposely give them like 5 to 10 minutes worth of awkward wait so that they have to at some point in time acknowledge the other,
Take
right?
in. Yeah.
And then we bridge that gap. We make jokes about it. We remind them that it's safe and it's good, And I
It,
think a lot of people do the leap, and so the experience ends up being fed by the food and kind of lubricated by the drink, but it's really a human thing. And so one thing we've noticed is after we started doing this better, that people pick up each other's bills. They give each other a glass of wine that they brought, even if it's a random guest, that people are more willing to share, that they poke fun at a neighboring table in a cordial way. And I think we are we are on the precipice of forgetting how to do those things, and that it is no longer to force. Like we need venues like Nouri and Appetite to remind us.
Now, I'm going to put on my restaurateur hat for a second, which you're also an owner operator, right? So the experience that I've had, a wonderful one, is very tactile and very much in person, experiential in all the ways. Your senses when you come into a restaurant take in, as you said, the art, the music, the senses, the smell, and then, of course, the food and everything else around you, including other guests. That experience is a wonderful experience. In today's world, you have a couple of other things here that I want to bring up and then have you react to, if you don't mind. One is a world of, Michelin stars and other categorizations where they want to be like Nouri is X, and in my case, the Lighthouse is Y. When people ask me what food we serve, I say, well, it's sort of Mediterranean inspired. It's the closest I can find to explain, because I wasn't set out to do like, Italian or Turkish or Lebanese or Brazilian. But I think people almost find comfort. They want that categorization. Certainly, nothing against those award givers. God bless them. They keep the places humming. But I think they want that even more. In fact, they even categorize that per, best Italian, best this,
of
best
course,
that.
yeah.
So you're going against that trend. And then thirdly, there's social media, where some of these experiences are not easily translatable. Fine, we have now video and audio and all of that. But to me, in Nouri experience, no matter how many videos you post or pictures of the dishes, you really have to go and see it. You know what I mean? So, but all of these things today matter in the success and ultimately sustainability financially of a restaurant. So how do you reconcile these forces?
I think you have to do good in all of those areas. And so we do our best to understand the platforms and the systems that we have to engage and participate in. I started with a certain level of young arrogance, I guess.
Yeah, I don't need this. A bit of snobbery, a little bit of arrogance. It's good. Arrogance is good.
I mean, it taught me a ton. And the reality is, when we first opened the restaurant, I used to forbid people of taking pictures, for example. We did.
Yeah, that's not going to happen today.
Impossible. And now I look back and I'm like, what an idiot. I would have looked at myself.
If they can't post it, Ivan, then, to some people, that's the whole experience.
Yeah, precisely. When we first opened, the first design I had of the restaurant was a communal table only, right? And it was my wife that turned to me and said, do you want to eat at a communal table 100% of the time? What if we're talking about our child? What if we're talking about this? I don't have kids, but that's I started to realize at every step of the way that my own experience as a diner is also, maybe it's slightly different than my experience as a producer of food, a cook, a chef, a thinker. And when you reconcile both of those, I think you end up doing better jobs. And so I think I'm not a fan of social media in a way, but I also believe that it has potential for good, right? And so instead of focusing on the fact that it distracts people, that it gets you completely addicted to dopamine in small amounts, and before you know it, you're burnt out. Like I could focus on this, but I can also use it as a platform to articulate in the best possible way why what we're doing is important. And so I think you need it, since we're in the world, we play the game of the world, right? We and this is a part of the experience. But I don't make this the focus. And I used to when I started. I remember this. I think it was the realization that very quickly that superimposes the value of what you're doing to the point where you start to do things because of the recognition, because of the validation.
100%.
Then suddenly your IP is gone down the drain, right? And you see that with a lot of chefs today as well. I think something that started as unique and original that ends up just becoming a veneer of itself because it keeps the machine running.
In fact, it even affects how you're thinking about your own brand and expansion. As you said, it affects the IP. I mean, we have 4 restaurants in the UAE. 2 of them are in malls. And you know, when we were looking at awards and things like MENA 50 Best and similar, right? We are more of a casual fine dining. It's not a fine dining restaurant, but you know, people said, well, you know, because you're in a mall and you're not only one location, you have multi locations. This is going to go against you. And all of a sudden, I started for a minute, and I think I caught myself going from how I feel about how I want to expand this brand. I was very proud of the fact that actually a brand like ours can be in a design district, but also translate in a mall setting, and they look very differently. But both can have a different experience, but a very good, hopefully, experience. To almost being a bit shaming myself, be like, oh, well, maybe I shouldn't be in malls because that's not cool. And if I'm not cool, then I'm not getting the awards. So you do have this doubt. There's no question about it. And it took me and a conversation with a friend to come back and say, I should do what I like to do best, give the best experience to the guests. And then all the rest is, as you said, if it comes, fantastic. It helps tell the story, but it's not how you're planning your stories and your brand evolution.
Yeah, I agree with that position. And I'm sure for you, it must have felt liberating once you made that decision, right?
It did. It took a while. It was not an immediate decision. In fact, I would even admit that for a short while, I was kind of thinking about how do we court this interest? And then I sort of realized that that's not the way to go about it, and that it's not really my genuine interest, and it's not what I started this. So it's going back to first principles. And I feel you've done a lot of that. And I love that you started this conversation when I asked you about whether this was deliberate. You said it evolved. Because to me, one of the beautiful things for entrepreneurs, and you're one of them, whether you're coming from a food production perspective or starting any space, is you start something and then you refine and iterate until it kind of clicks. And sometimes it clicks for a while and then it stops clicking as well. That's very humbling. And I think makes any consumer facing business very difficult, frankly. But I feel like you trust your instincts, and you seem to kind of have developed a set of values that you really believe in. I mean, that's kind of almost like your raison d'etre.
Especially because in the process of trying this out, like you described, and evolving into it, I realized that the less authentic you are, the less it makes sense, really.
Yes.
And so you can't, I realize now that perhaps other things would have been easier if I had only done this, but I am not that person. To enjoy that process has been the best part of my job, really. I think to do something that is meaningful and authentic and provide a service is of great importance. But if it betrays core principles, then what's the point, right? I think we see a lot of people out there who are very unhappy about their very successful careers. And really all they wanted was to be like a sheep herder or a honey farmer, or like, you know, I think the point there is very obvious. And so I have the benefit of going home, going like, yeah, I fought the fight today, and tomorrow I get to keep at it. And it's engaging. I mean, whoever said open a restaurant, it's going to be fun, was like totally BS, because this job is hard on the knees. It's and they say, oh, it gets easier with time. I'm like, no. Maybe you learn to let go a bit more.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. You learn to create a tiny bit of distance to let go, but I don't think it gets easier. In fact, I think with some measure of success, it becomes more difficult because of exactly
Yeah.
what you just said earlier. There is then that pressure is, what do I do with that IP now? Like, do I expand? Do I keep doing the same thing? Do I, in your case, take Nouri and go to Hong Kong or Dubai? Or, it's so it opens up doors. And ironically, that creates, I think, some anxiety
Yeah.
about an indecision.
Yeah, I think you touched on a word that's very it's instrumental for modern living. And if it's not going to come from work, it will come from other things. I think we are, especially because of our relationship with tech, with money, that anxiety is part and parcel of modern day life, and learning to manage it is the make or break, I think, for a lot of a person's life. So, but I do believe that restaurant life has taught me how to handle it better, to be honest. And so it's very funny when people are like, I would never be able to do this thing. It would make me go crazy. The reality is, I think I'm less crazy because of this job.
In case you want to contest my planting the Egyptian flag over hummus, check out my conversation with Hani Malki, or Bedouin foodie. We talk about the recorded history of hummus on the episode. There's also a link in our show notes. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation about honesty and staying true to one's roots, and how Ivan's mother has inspired his lack of complacency. That's right after the short break. Welcome back. You're listening to the Lighthouse Conversations with my guest, Chef Ivan Brehm. At some point, I think you referred in some of the articles about your cooking as crossroads cooking. There is a going back to the roots element to your restaurant and to your cooking. There is certainly a hybridity, a very strong sense of hybridity, which I can completely relate to. How does that manifest it in how you think about your product day to day? Do you go in with that is it intentionally, or is it subconscious and just sort of spills out?
I think it's both. I think there is a natural tendency, just because of my upbringing, the fact that I'm from Brazil, that we're all very culturally diverse, and it's very hard for you to do the same thing twice.
Yeah.
People are consistently changing things and innovating older recipes, and that's part and parcel. It's imbued. But when the concept opened, I think to stay true to the idea, it became very important that we pursue that in every element. And so everything about the space is consistently weighed to express diversity in all forms, be it with staff and gender diversity, with the music and the incredible array of songs we play, the types of ingredients, the types of relationships.
How do you do that without it becoming tropey, and becoming buzzwordy? Because, you say diversity, and even I, now like immediately recoil a bit, because like, oh my God, there we go again. He's going to give me the full, and I know you're not. I'm just saying, so how do you really do that? And it doesn't look forced, or he's just trying to be a do-gooder and tell a diversity story?
Yeah, I think it is who we are first. And so I live that reality. I think it is.
I think that's right.
And to have this conversation about gender, I also have to evaluate if my performance at some point in time has been patriarchal and sexist, right? And to go through the process of going like, yeah, maybe I need to reform some of my ways here. And so I think that's why
the self-examination element of it.
Yeah, it prevents it from becoming tropey, precisely because of that honesty. I think we are approaching it with that thing in mind. If we set out to open a restaurant that's about the interconnection that exists between people, then, and we fail to live that in our relationship with staff, with guests, with music, with decor, then we're not really living that proposition, right? And I think that's why it feels that way. And here is I think this ties a little bit back to the question you had earlier on about the importance and relevance of social media and how to navigate that, because quite quickly we've become consumed by this notion of tropes, fads, right? And so people ask, I love that question. I'm sure you had it as well. A magazine, normally it's a a high net worth magazine comes to you and says, "What do you think will be the next trends for 2024?" Right? That article runs on like December 2023.
I'm well
And
aware.
you're like, what do you want it to be? I think people have forgotten that we choose the trend, right? With our vote, with our purchasing power, with our decisions. And the trend's going to be what you decide it to be. So instead of focusing on doing gender equal conversations because you see them on Instagram, how about just, do you want to have crappy relationships with people of different genders in your work? The answer is no. Do something about it.
Ivan, I have an answer for you for the trend for 2024. I'm jumping a bit ahead because we're not even in December. It's my green pepper. Can you see it? Called
Oh
Pep.
my
Well, my
God.
daughter called it Pep. So Pep is not particularly happy, but it really does everything because I
Is
can
that a
squeeze.
stress ball?
Yeah.
That is rock and roll.
It
I love
alleviates
it.
anxiety. It's food related. It's green, which I predict is new color for 2024. So anyone that's going to ask me this year, I'm going to present Pep. How do you reconcile between the mind space, being a chef, coming up with new ideas, menu development, food development, and then the business side? At the end of the day, you have to pay your employees and you have to make money to survive another day. How
Yeah,
much time do you spend on that, and how do you weigh between those two?
I think as I grow older, I am starting to spend more and more time taking care of operational issues that aren't the cooking and creative bits. And I think I'm blessed enough to have good people to help
Work
me
with you.
do that. But I realize also that chefs aren't necessarily the most well equipped business leaders, right? That we're not necessarily the most talented number crunches. And that is a learning curve for me too. And so, because I care for the business, you end up learning how to handle it. And I'm not going to say I'm the best at it, but I can say that I'm learning very, very quickly.
No, that's great. And it's a shift. I had Daniel Boulud on this podcast some time back. He was in Dubai. And
Mm,
one of the things that struck me about him was how he made that transition from essentially being a chef to a businessman.
yeah.
And I don't know if it came natural to him or now he's just done it long enough that it felt natural.
Hmm.
But most certainly, when he spoke to me, it was fascinating how much of it was he really now had confidence and a grasp of the business element of his brand and IP. And I think
Yeah.
that serves him probably really well. He's obviously significantly older than you and sort of from a different generation, but some clearly chefs want to make that transition and have an element of both. And some I think don't and would say, I'd rather just be in the kitchen. Either someone else deals with it or I'm just not going to do it. And I think
Yeah.
outcomes
I'm
are
caught.
obviously very different.
They are. I'm currently, it's a very relevant talk for my present moment because I'm very much caught in between both of these. I think the personal gratification that I derive from cooking a service and being immersed in the actual moment of serving guests and putting things together, it's very hard to explain to anybody. But I'm also starting to realize that the potential outcomes that come out of that are very finite and limited, and that
Yeah.
I have responsibilities that are greater than my enjoyment of my work now. And so I think I approach this with some tension. Let's put it like this: if I could choose, I'd probably be cooking service every day,
Yeah.
all the time. But I wouldn't be able to retain my staff to promote, potentially offer them other opportunities for their own development too. And so I think I'm in that process right now. Actually, it's a
And
really
there are
timely
so many
process.
ways to go about it. You know, I watched on the plane coming in, I think it was a Netflix documentary on Wolfgang Puck. And one
Mm,
of the things that was very evident, he was in a restaurant or started a restaurant in Hollywood, in California, you know, very star power. But then he leveraged that for, which I think now is a much bigger business, probably, of a catering business. Um, so, you know, when he does things like the Oscars every year and so on and so forth. So he had that, I know these people, but he used that brand recognition for another purposes, which solidified his company. his business, I'm sure, and gave him a far more predictable outcome. Because as you and I know, when you're in a single restaurant or even in anything that's sort of consumer facing directly, you're somewhat at the mercy of the footfall. This week is slow. Next week, they're not here. So I was very interested. I don't know him. It didn't go into it in the documentary, but whether he did this kind of consciously or not. But he then created a very stable, let's call it, revenue line for his business, built on his IP and excellence to support his other dreams, so to speak. That seems to me to be a very rational way of thinking about IP and thinking about growing businesses as you kind of start evolving from single restaurant, single facing customers every day and every night. But it's very hard because there's so many options and you get very, I think, tense about which direction to go.
I think you see, but it's a brilliant point you made, because you do see the sustainable models are the ones that manage to keep their core unshaken. And I think the restaurants that I've seen that have not managed to survive, and I am looking at even very famous restaurants. You saw what's happening with the potential closure of Noma within the next 100%. Year. I think it's, if you expand beyond your ethos and the apple falls a little too far off from the tree, I think the restaurant starts to feel it. And I think the thing with Wolfgang Puck is that his branding and his restaurants are so very much him. You know, yes. they ooze of that flair. And I think that's why it works. And you can see it across the board. I think the most successful restaurants and restaurants that we try to emulate and learn from, to be honest, are those restaurants that could be doing something, for example, completely unsustainable at a time where everybody's getting reminded of being sustainable, like burning wood or, you know, serving meats. But they're true to their story, and they do that unabashedly and with love and passion and dedication, serve a good product, and because of it, I think the restaurant thrives. And so I think being committed and expanding from that point is a good lesson to learn. He's a master. Wolfgang is one of the most business savvy chefs that I've had the opportunity to briefly meet, but also learn from. I've seen the documentary you're talking about. It's
you have. Okay. Yeah, it's about one single event, I think, and it's very interesting because that savviness really comes through. I was fascinated by it. When I look at what you've done and I look at Nouri, I mean, to me, for example, you know, I can even see it being more of a lifestyle brand, really. I mean, I could almost see it like being as much of a boutique hotel as, you know, a multidisciplinary space as a restaurant. So it's interesting. You go into places and you get a feel. And I think the way you approach things could apply to so much more that's not just purely F&B, frankly, which is interesting, you know, whereas someone like Wolfgang Puck, to his credit, you know, I think understood that celebrity attraction and connections he had and so on can be, you know, monetized, frankly, in many different ways that go beyond just people coming to his restaurant every single night.
Yeah. But you have to keep that window and door open, right? You can no longer afford, unless, I think there's another alternative here, which is the very sustainable restaurant that is a small, that's committed. Yes. And it's also a beautiful model to run by. And I'm romantically attracted to that notion of the Japanese sushi where the chef lives on the second floor and comes downstairs every morning and sets a table for 10 people and just produces everything that he wants. And enough is also one way to look at it, right? Is this enough for me? And is that okay? You know, I think there are two ways of going about this. And that's also part of the confusion sometimes for me as a developing businessman, is how much growth is necessary. You know, why, and if the sky is the limit here, then am I prepared to pay the price for some of that?
There's no question. There is a price. I can tell you that much already, that you pay for it, you know, just to preempt. But also you have to be true to yourself. I think that's
Yeah.
really key. In my case, for example, I'll be very honest, I was not particularly interested in just having one place and going to it every day. It's not who I am. It's not what I want to do. And I had to be honest about that as well. And I think that's much better to come to that realization and be honest about it than pretend that's what you want out of life. Now, being in cities like Singapore, like Dubai, I think also they are so growth oriented.
Yeah.
Again, if you are maybe in the old world, as it was called, and old Europe, as a Minister of Defense in the US called it, Mr. Rumsfeld, you know, I think maybe you don't have that pressure. I mean, ultimately, in my case, I can be very honest, it comes from me. It's not coming from an external force. But living in a city that has been so transformed, similar to Singapore, over the last decade or two, I think always puts growth at front and center in your mind, at least. So it's hard to run away from that. I'll be honest.
I agree. I totally agree. And you can mimic that in nature, right? I think there are lots of, not to get too ethereal here, but I think that systems are either growing or they're receding and dying. I think that's a natural progression of things. It's just what's the direction of the growth, and I think there is the answer you gave. I think you grow in the direction of your true vision, right? Your core beliefs there. And like meeting a few Japanese chefs, for example, I could tell that even in the context of them feeding the same 10 people day in, day out, 5 days a week or 6 days a week, that they approach their day to day with that mentality of growth in the little thing, right?
Yes.
They want to make the thing
very different model,
the most
yes.
precise thing, but the idea of growth is the same.
Also very Japanese.
When they decided not to continue to grow, that would probably be the time for them to retire, because they can't take refining this chow and mushi one more day. It would be a bit too much. But the premise, I think, still remains that growth is unbeatable. And if you feel like you're not growing, then maybe you're at the wrong job.
And so many things feed into it. I mean, again, we go back to roots and upbringing. I mean, like I grew up in Cairo in a large city. I'm very much an urban child. I'm not someone that, I think would survive very long in suburbia or, kind of smaller towns. And I had to come kind of to terms with this. Even Dubai, which is a beautiful city, I sometimes, when I travel, seek friction, because I grew up in a city with so much more friction.
Yeah.
And I realized, it took me a while to understand that I need it. So I go to New York, I see like the garbage piled up. I'm like, oh,
yeah, of course.
Yeah,
the honking,
exactly.
The dispute for the taxi, the hackling,
exactly right.
Yeah.
Exactly right. So I don't miss necessarily the car accident disputes of Cairo, but I miss a little bit that friction. And for me, it's the spice of life. For someone else, it's like, yeah, you're crazy. I mean, why on earth would you want to have this in your life? And I think, again, it comes back to who you are and how truthful you want to live in terms of what makes sense for you.
I completely agree. I think your description of your experiences are very similar to mine. At some point in time, I think we all need a bit of dirt under our nails. Exactly. And if we don't have it where we are, we need to travel. And I think there's a Portuguese saying that goes something like, if you don't have enough trouble in your life, you just cause it. So at some point in time, if it's too boring, you need to spice things up.
Ivan, it's been a great and multifaceted conversation. Thank you. I'll leave you with just one last question. I'm curious, you've had many influences, obviously, both in terms of cultures and places. You talked in some of the articles about some of your family members, notably your grandfather and your grandmother. To your mind, what has been the greatest influence in terms of people on you, and in how you live your life today?
It's probably my mother, I would say. I think that very close nuclear center there, but probably my mother.
Why is that, if you don't mind me asking? Like, what?
Because
beyond being your mother, I mean, what is there something in particular?
Yeah, she's a pain in the butt.
I'm gonna take this out, because if she listens to this, she's gonna come after me.
No, she's very instigating. She's consistently provoking provoking you to come out of yourself, provoking your thoughts, your answers. She was
I
very
love that.
much, and I think that translates to pain in the butt, but for the right reasons. I think she's always been trying to shake things up a bit. I remember growing up, and she would change her computer mouse. You know, on Monday she would have it on the right side, on Tuesday she'd have it on the left side. And she was always trying to seek for that certain threshold of discomfort that keeps you on
Out of your
edge.
comfort zone.
Yeah, and I learned very early to put that. You know, anytime that things looked remotely like we were getting a bit complacent, the whole thing would get turned around. Suddenly rooms change, you know, let's fix the living room. And she was like this in her food preferences and always exposing us to a ton. You know, we led a very rich cultural upbringing because of her, not with a lot of money. It's just you don't need much to keep people engaged, and kids need very little. You just need to keep them entertained, and life's pretty entertaining. So I think she cracked that code.
Thank you for sharing that. And so much of honestly what you do, I'm not saying this just to compliment you, is pushing those boundaries. So I'm sure she's extremely proud of you. It shows up in everything. I mean, from that night we spent at your restaurant to conversation we're having now, how much you're pushing your own boundaries and trying to explore, you know, what feels comfortable, but maybe even a little bit uncomfortable. I salute that. I think it's a great ethos. Wish you all the best. We hope
Thank you,
to
Hashim.
have you come to Dubai soon to visit us.
Absolutely. I can't wait.
And I'm look forward to our next trip to Singapore as well.
Rock and roll. It's been lovely talking to you, and thank you for having me, Hashim.
Thank you, Ivan. All the best. Take care.
Speak soon. Ciao, ciao.
Bye-bye. Thank you for joining us. If you know someone who would love to hear our conversation, please share it with them. That's how we essentially grow, with friends sharing our episodes on social media, on WhatsApp, and other ways. The Lighthouse Conversation is hosted by me, Hashim Montasser. Our producer is Chirag Desai, and our content director is Farah Al-Sharif. You can connect with us on Instagram at thelighthouse_podcast for behind-the-scenes videos and more. Also, listen to all our previous episodes in your podcast app or at thelighthouse.ae/podcast. We'll see you again in 2 weeks.